The WA Live Exporters Association, WALEA, of course, is host for the next 2 days, and WALEA has been around for about 50 years, almost as long as the modern livestock export industry, WA. So today what we're going to do is give some long-standing members of the industry, former chairman of WALEA, a chance to reminisce about the evolution of the industry, talk about some of the success and what it's been. To moderate that, we have Dr. Peter Barnard. Now, Peter's an agricultural economist. He's known to many people. He's been around the industry for, well, at least 25 years or more, including he headed up Meat and Livestock Australia's Live Export and International Marketing Division for many years. But Peter's, with his own consultancy now, provides advice to the industry in a whole range of ways, and he's really an authority on policy particularly, but all aspects of the industry. So Peter's going to conduct this session with Steve Meerwald, John Edwards and John Cunnington. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Terry, and welcome to this session on the history and evolution of the live trade from Western Australia. Very soon, the Western Australia Live Exporters Association, WALEA, will have its 50th year birthday. And that 50th year birthday allows us to celebrate and reflect on the last 50 years. The last 50 years of achievements, the last 50 years of contributions made by the trade, the last 50 years of changes that have occurred to the trade, and the last 50 years of the challenges that have been faced by the trade. Partly this session will represent a stroll down history's lane, but it won't only represent a stroll down history's lane. It's about gleaning the lessons of the past to continue to shape the direction of the trade in the future. To talk about the last 50 years, I'm pleased that I have three very eminent panellists with me today. All three, as Terry said, have been ex-chairs of WALEA. The guy in the middle, Steve Meerwald, was chair from 91 to 98. The guy on the end, John Edwards, was chair from 2003 to 2013. And John Cunnington, immediately to my left, is the current chair, and he's been chair since 2018. Look, I've got some questions to ask the panel, and they've received advance notice of these questions, and I'm told that they've even prepared slides on some of these questions. So I've got some questions to ask, and depending on how we go for time, there might be an opportunity at the end to have questions from the floor. So let's get on with it. Let's start talking about the last 50 years. And of course, most of that last 50 years of the trade from Western Australia has been dominated by the sheep trade to the Middle East. The sheep trade to the Middle East grew from small beginnings about 50 years ago to a mighty, mighty, mighty trade worth cumulative to Australia $10 billion. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of money, $10 billion to Australia, and involved the export of about 200 million sheep. So, you know, that's such a big trade, particularly for Western Australia, and most of those sheep came from Western Australia. John Edwards, I think, of all the panellists, was the one most involved or significantly involved in the sheep trade over that last 50 years. So, John, I'm wondering if you can reflect on the beginnings of the trade and what caused that such a rapid growth in the trade to the mighty trade that it became? John?
Thanks, Peter. That's a big statement. The gentleman to my right here is equally or further long-standing in the industry than I've been. I guess the best way to start is the trade in its early infancy dates back to the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and involved sheep penned on decks on board vessels in makeshift wooden pens. The sheep trade in those days was primarily to Singapore, Malaysia and Hong Kong, and only involved small numbers of animals on those particular vessels per voyage. The Singapore shipper trade, which was coming of age in the 50s and the 60s and utilising coal heavy aged weathers out of Western Australia, became the most prominent at the time and notable when the passenger liner, the Centaur, was taking several thousand sheep each voyage out of the port of Fremantle. Early pioneers of the trade, unfortunately we have some of them here today, and we need to be thankful for that, long recognised the potential of the sheep exports to the Middle East in the late 1950s, a region of large sheep meat eaters, a 1960s building boom triggered by newfound oil wealth and large numbers of foreign workers required in that part of the region to undertake this work, who too were predominantly Muslims, all needing to be fed. Those pioneers saw in Australia at the same time a ready-made supply of merino sheep, all able to be slaughtered in market and to cultural and religious beliefs, which was highly important in this equation. Refrigeration and cold stores, of course, were very limited, so wet markets and the same day consumption were the order of the day. 1960 saw the first shipment of 2,500 sheep from Fremantle to Kuwait. From a modest 160,000 sheep exported that year, export numbers to the Middle East over the next decade rose quickly, and then into the millions onwards from 1973. It was in fact 1973 that the trade cracked the first million head per annum of live sheep exports. As the trade scaled up significantly, and eventually it rose to an all-time high of 7.7 million sheep exported in 1987. The live trade quickly became essential for WA sheep producers and the importing countries, and it played to the natural advantages of both. Our healthy merino sheep were highly sought after by our Middle East customers who needed live sheep and lots of them, and Australia was seen as a trusted, reliable supplier. And we just heard earlier on how Australia is viewed in that space. Important to note at that time, the WA sheep industry was gearing itself up very quickly to servicing the trade and enabling the rapid growth in trade. There was a significant investment by exporters and importers here in WA in feedlots, feed mills, transport logistics and vessel loading infrastructure, all to help provide an uninterrupted trade and supply of sheep for growth in the industry going forward. Importantly, WA's relative accessibility to the markets of the Middle East, shorter voyages, lower shipping costs and faster turnaround of vessels all contributed to WA being the major supplier of sheep over the next six decades to those first early markets of Kuwait and the UAE, and then subsequently to Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, who were all regular buyers of our sheep to this day, but also to those long-lost markets of Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Algeria and Libya, also being significant importers over the journey also.
Thanks, John. As I said in the introduction, we're partly here to celebrate 50 years of WALEA. I think Steve Meerwald, of those on the panel, is the earliest WALEA chair. So I'm wondering, Steve, if you could reflect on the early days of WALEA and the role that it played in the early development of the trade, and also how that role evolved over time.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for the opportunity to sort of present our history. I generally appreciate being asked to contribute and yesterday I had the pleasure of being a legend for the young livestock exporters at a function at Gage Roads in Fremantle. And interestingly, I'm not sure exactly why that venue was picked, but directly opposite berths 1 and 2, where in my tenure with WALEA, we exported about 30 million sheep. It sort of puts a bit of a highlight on how important WA is, and particularly for me, how important Fremantle is in terms of what the export industry means to me and what we contributed to the export industry through that period. I know that there's other people here who have spent many days, many nights, every public holiday in the last 30 years at the port in Fremantle, because that's how the ships turned up. So we were going to try and sort of ad-lib this, but going through the process, we thought that the messaging was too important to trust our failing memories and our fading reminiscences of what's there. So forgive us for reading it, but I think it's really important, the messages that we're trying to get through and the history. John will probably, young John, as opposed to old John, will do better than us, but old John and I are going to read, despite deliberating about ad-libbing. So the number of sheep exported from Australia since 1960 grew very rapidly. Exports broke the 1 million head per annum in 1973, as John had mentioned, and by 1977 had reached 3.4 million nationally, with the majority coming out of WA. WA was leading the way, and exporters here needed representation, particularly in the face of growing meat industry union opposition to the trade. WALEA was inaugurated in July 1977, so you might have seen on the opening slide it was almost 50 years. We've got 2 years to go. WALEA will turn 51 years before the federal government shuts down the sheep trade. Its founding chairman was Trevor Eastwood, who's a bit of, I felt quite honoured to be a legend, but Trevor Eastwood is a true legend here in Western Australia, and particularly in the livestock industry. He was representing Wesfarmers, and he would go on to be Wesfarmers' managing director and chairman. WALEA's membership at the time consisted of 9 exporters. And it would be remiss of me not to say that one of the names on that, the minutes of the first WALEA meeting, is a Hall of Famer, Mr. Graham Dawes, sitting in the second row here, trying not to be noticed. But so 48 years later, he's still here. I think we should honour that. So WALEA's role then and now is to ensure the export of livestock is conducted in the best interests of the industry, to support its viability and to ensure high standards of animal welfare and best practice occurs. So that was 48 years ago, so not much has changed. The association is also charged with discussions and negotiations with ALEC, government departments, peak councils and other stakeholders in the trade. WALEA members were also the catalyst for the formation of the National Representative Body for Live Exporters, the Australian Livestock Exporters Association, or ALEA, which was formed in the late 1970s. ALEA later went on to be the Australian Livestock Exporters Council as it stands today, and that change was in 1985. The WALEA chairman, Trevor Eastwood, was the inaugural chairman of ALEA also. I've got to do 2 things at once here, which is a bit complicated for me, so bear with me. WALEA had a seat at all of the initial steering committees for the trade's development, including the formative Live Exporters Consultative Committee, which developed to advise the government and, at those days, the AMLC. WA producers have long suffered from a lack of competition for their sheep, compared to their eastern states counterparts, simply due to the distance to market when looking for alternative to the small number of processors in the state. The reverse is true when we look at our overseas markets. WA is favourably positioned to supply the Middle East sheep markets and also much closer to our Asian neighbours, favouring our cattle producers. Advocacy since the formation of WALEA, being the catalyst for the founding of the Australian Livestock Exporters Association, and leading policy initiatives ever since, has been WALEA's mandate from its members. Exporters, producers and many supporting businesses as well as the Australian economy, have been the beneficiaries of these efforts for almost 50 years. And as a WALEA chairman from whenever I started in the 90s, I can tell you that I was standing on the shoulders of giants, and Trevor Eastwood, Graham Dawes, John Francis, there's a whole lot of people before me and have continued on past me that have been very strong advocates for the trade and worked for the interests of the trade from Western Australia, but nationally and for producers around Australia, and I hope that work can continue.
So Steve, we've mentioned a number of times the rapid growth in the trade, and both you and Andrew Robb talked about the opposition from the union movement that instigated. I'm wondering if you just go a little further into that opposition and how WALEA approached the challenges that existed.
Sure. So farmers saw the emerging live sheep trade as a new and profitable outlet for their cast-for-age wethers at the end of the wool-producing life, and it's really important to remember that that's what the trade was developed on. It wasn't about lambs or hoggets. It was Australia was a wool-producing nation. There were lots more merinos as a percentage of the flock then than there are now, and cast-for-age wethers were worth mutton value, and they were predominantly very heavy, very high-quality sheep. The producers saw this advantage in the live export market. The live export trade was buying sheep 12 months of the year and in growing numbers as new markets emerged and trade volumes increased. The Australian Meat Industry Workers Union was becoming increasingly militant towards the live sheep trade in the mid-1970s as they argued live exports was exporting Australian jobs. This culminated in pickets at feedlots and wharves around WA and in the eastern states, eventually leading to the federal government imposing quota ratios for every live sheep exported. A higher number of sheep carcasses must be shipped. Slaughter values for sheep around this time had collapsed to $2 per head, whilst export prices for suitable wethers were $6 to $8, and farmers for the first time saw the imperative of the trade. WALEA members in 1978 were instrumental in working with grower groups to fight back and get vessels loaded by farmers at Esperance, Albany and Fremantle. Over the next 5 years, the unions continued their waterfront battle against the live trade further, threatening trade and interrupting farmers, feedlotters and exporters' livelihoods. That's a motley group of protesters. Interesting dress standards back in the day. WALEA and the newly formed National Body of Live Exporters, ALEA, took up the case with the government, who eventually concluded that live sheep exports cannot be replaced by the carcass trade, and farmers' incomes would have fallen $155 million in the period 1981-82 if a quota of one carcass for one live sheep exported had applied. The value of the trade is further highlighted when we consider the impacts of the wool reserve price scheme crash in 1991, leading to an overnight collapse of wool and sheep prices. Over the next decade, the Australian sheep population would go into freefall. Sheep meat processors were overwhelmed with supply and farmers began destroying sheep under a government incentivised program. Live sheep exporters were instrumental in uploading hundreds of thousands of sheep monthly from distressed parts of the country, helping to alleviate an even greater financial disaster for our producers. Australia experienced what was to become known as the Millennium Drought from 2001 to 2009, especially in southern and eastern Australia. Processors again were inundated with sheep, and again the versatility of the live sheep trade came to the fore, with sheep exporters able to position vessels to those states hardest hit and shift hundreds of thousands of sheep literally overnight from barren paddocks into export feedlots onto vessels and away to markets.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, the live sheep trade was there in the darkest hours for Australian farmers during the liquidation in the late 80s, early 90s, and the millennium drought. It provided an outlet that wouldn't have otherwise existed for those sheep, and I think that's an incredibly important aspect of the live sheep trade over the last 50 years. John Edwards, I mean, we've talked about support by farmers for the trade. We've talked about opposition from unions, the meat unions. What role did governments and regulators play in those early days, and while the trade was rapidly expanding? I mean, were they supportive of the trade, and what role generally did they play?
Peter, I think it's important we touch on that statement Steve made a little earlier about the ABARES report from government in the very early 1980s over the AMI-EU disputes that were running on the wharf through the 70s and early 80s, and concluding that live sheep exports cannot be replaced by the carcass trade, and farmers' returns would have fallen 155 million in 1981, 1982 if a ratio of one carcass for one live sheep export had been applied to the industry. I think that's a pretty important statement, because in 1981 and 1982, Australia exported in both of those years 6 million sheep, of which over 3 million each year came out of Western Australia. That in itself was proving how valuable the live export trade was proving to be for WA producers and Australian growers nationally. It would be fair to say that during the formative years of the sheep trade, the trade had the support of the government because of the significant earnings it was generating for the economy and the flow-on effects across the Australian supply chain. Despite the meat workers' union's best efforts in the 70s and early 80s to unseat the trade, they failed, but took a new tact in the 1990s, joining forces with animal activist groups to up the ante against both sheep and cattle exports, with cattle exports starting to come of age back then. With politics and populist votes creeping into the trade, concern was there, of course, that the government would flip-flop over the trade. Live cattle exports were now on the rise, and the unions were on the attack again. Unrealistic demands by the unions over enterprise bargaining, industrial unrest and exorbitant processing costs all aided the live trade's economic support from the Australian government during these years, but significant regulation and oversight of the trade wasn't far away. It'd be remiss of me not to mention that here in Western Australia, WALEA and exporters received very good support in collaborative work with the the West Australian Department of Agriculture over solving issues with the live sheep trade at the time. WALEA and exporters had long been working with the Department of Agriculture researchers here, and I need to really mention Dr. John Suter, Dr. Richard Norris and Colin McDonald, who were all researchers at the time and devoted immense resources and effort in working with the industry over in efforts of investigating the inappetence or shy feeder syndrome in sheep during the preparation and sea voyage, as it was a significant contributor to mortality at sea in those early days. Early identification of shy feeders in consignments, changes to handling and pre-feeding practices and ration formulation all helped reduce morbidity and mortality and came directly from that trial work and cooperation between WALEA and the WA Department of Agriculture. The department were also instrumental in their work with helping industry develop vaccination protocols around scabby mouth disease, enabling exporters to ship with confidence back to Saudi Arabia.
For you young people in the audience, that's a video.
That's okay, Steve. No, it's good that you raised that, and it took a lottery of input from the exporters at the time to coin that phrase. And again, our most recognisable member of the industry, Graham Dawes, was the one that captured that phrase there to start the campaign.
Sorry, supplementary. Just so you know, that importance of me in my legendary status, I was the chairman of the Scabby Mouth Coordinating Committee.
And we all had scabby mouth, Steve. But yes, significantly those protocols allowed the restart of the Saudi trade, which had been closed for 10 years. The trade ceased in 1990 and reopened in the year 2000. So very significant research work by the department aiding the cause of WALEA and WA exporters to get that trade back on track. In combination with the Scratch to Catch the Market campaign, this initiative had flow-on effect to protecting all the other sheep markets, which was a significant windfall for particularly sheep producers here in WA. I guess also in the same discussion around governments and their involvement in the trade, when it came to finding and developing new markets, of course early overseas government trade missions may have been representative in their efforts to do this, but it was WALEA exporters, the association and the broader association nationally, in many instances through their own initiatives, who were the ones that sought out and developed new sheep markets with their importer counterparts for Australian sheep. It was the exporters in cooperation with the importers and industry resources who helped set up the facilities, including feedlots, handling systems, transport and slaughterhouses, along with training in every single market that we had at that time. Those markets included the start of the trade in 1960 with Kuwait through to Turkey in 2010. They were all developed this way, and it was WALEA in many instances working with exporter members and through ALEC to get the all-important health protocols sorted with government. It should also be noted that it was the live trade exports responsible for the early development of the frozen meat trade to the region as the first meat traders, with those live importers themselves loading box meat in reefer space on their own vessels carrying livestock at the same time.
Thanks, John. Just so interesting, I think, that, governments, both at a state and federal level, were supportive of the trade during those years of rapid expansion. Of course, they had to be, because, that was a significant outlet for sheep for Australian farmers. But John Cunnington, I'm just conscious that we haven't talked much about cattle at this stage. So can you just reflect a little perhaps on the cattle trade over the last 50 years and where it might be going to?
Yeah, well, I think I'll touch mainly on the future, if that's all right, or where I want it to be going. And slated by many economists to be globally the fourth largest economy by 2050, we have a population that is young, growing and rapidly emerging, with its middle class as one of our closest neighbours in Indonesia. We have a history of supplying the feeder cattle to that market for over 40 years, so there's really deep ties and relationships there. We have President Prabowo now coming out and mandating a strategic shift away from its beef supply policy, moving away from importing the frozen meat and focusing instead on procuring the live cattle and raising the live cattle domestically. It was just yesterday I heard on the radio that Jakarta has now overtaken Tokyo as the largest city in the world with over 42 million people. All of this is only 3.5 days sailing away from Broome. And now we've got the new infrastructure with the floating wharf that can run 24/7, 365. In saying this though, I believe we sometimes take Indonesia for granted. That'll always be there. At the same time that President Prabowo is making these strategic shifts towards live cattle, he's also making strategic shifts towards relationships with the BRICS partners, so the Brazil, Russia, India, and Indonesia has become the latest partner in that. So I think it's imperative on the trade and Australia to make deeper ties at government to government levels and also business to business levels and further invest in these relationships. It is our most important market now, and it's essential for the live export industry into the future. If we're looking at a WA perspective, Indonesia does remain as our primary market, with Vietnam second, as Israel has dropped recently, of course. But it's also significant to realise that not every market can be the largest, and it's really good to see markets like Jordan. It's been increasing with cattle year on year for the last 3 years and is at its highest levels and higher since 2013. I mean, Middle East at the moment is taking so many cattle from South America, yet we're seeing increases into markets like Jordan, so that's really positive to see. We've now got new health protocols with Iraq. We've got re-emerging markets with breeders now going back to Turkey. We've had multiple shipments now go to Mexico. So, I mean, there is positive signs of those long-established markets re-emerging. But when we break it all down, the very simple equation that puts Australia live cattle's position in a strong position is its locational advantage to Southeast Asia. It's a region with a strong emerging middle class that values the importance of red meat in their diet, and Australia produces the right cattle for that region and are comparatively disease-free. So putting this all together, we're in the prime position for a strong industry with growth potential, but we can't rest on our laurels and just expect it to always be there. Others are willing and ready to replace us, especially as our regulatory restrictions make things more and more difficult.
We've talked about many improvements to the trade that have occurred over the last 50 years, but perhaps an area where those improvements are most obvious is in the vessels used to carry livestock. I mean, gosh, the vessels of today are virtually unrecognisable from those of the past. So, John, could I get you, John Edwards, to reflect on changes in vessels over the last 50 years, and then perhaps John Cunnington to talk a little bit about cattle?
Peter, there's only one way to capture that, and it's been transformative in the sense that the vessels have come ahead in leaps and bounds. There's no denying that. And certainly significant to the development of both the sheep and cattle export trades and volumes shipped has been the level of investment in vessels by exporters, importers and owner-operators providing charter vessels. As markets grew and sheep export numbers increased, innovation, efficiency and economies of scale drove the size of the vessels engaged in the trade. Certainly profitability encouraged investment in ships, and so in the 1970s and early 80s, as export numbers started to increase exponentially, there was a rapid movement away from the small converted general purpose cargo ships that gave the industry its start to the super carriers, those converted tankers with a superstructure of two-tiered sheep pens on their decks and fodder and water carried in their tanks below. These vessels had a capacity of 50 to 120,000 sheep each, and consequently the yearly carrying capacity of the trade was significantly increased with the regular turnaround of these vessels from ports here in Australia. With these vessels came improvements to design, feed and water storage and delivery systems on board. In the early 2000s arrived the next generation of sheep carriers, some converted vessels, others custom built from the keel up, built solely for the purpose of carrying sheep or cattle, all on single full-height decks. The template for what the trade would become, multi-species vessels that could carry sheep or cattle and trade to near neighbours or across vast oceans. Significant improvements to ventilation and air turnover were developed for these vessels, as well as huge onboard water producing capacity through reverse osmosis systems. The design and build evolution for sheep vessels saw continuous improvements in animal welfare outcomes and voyage success rates to arrive at record-breaking levels consistently achieved these days.
Thanks. And like the sheep trade, the cattle trade started in the early days with a few animals on the deck of makeshift pens, but as demand grew, we saw small capacity converted cargo vessels housing cattle below the decks, and in the 70s and 80s as exporters started to increase, but they were struggling to get over that 100,000 per annum size. And a lot of the issues that were coming across for the vessels of those size was the berth size and draft at the discharging ports. So much so but exporters always made it happen, even when they couldn't get a berth. Sometimes they just pushed them into the water and swam them to shore. So we're not allowed to do that now, Daff. It wasn't until the early 1990s, when the cattle exports rose sharply, that we started to see the purpose-built ships, the ones that few of us know today, the Bison and Buffalo and Devon and Shorthorn Express, and the Wellard first built the Al Nilam, that then later became the Angus Express. And then we saw as time went on, as the super vessels started to come in, it gave greater comfort to the animals, and I've been lucky enough during my time to sail on a number of these different vessels, whether it was the older vessels or the newer ones, such as the Ocean Swagman, when that was a newer build. And the amount of difference that you saw as the years went on was remarkable. We also learnt from design perspectives as well. I'm not sure if anyone ever had the delight of going on a vessel called the Badar 3, and it used to have a wonderful design of a spiral to try to get the sheep all the way to the bottom of the vessel. It was always an interesting one to load and discharge. And then they decided to put a sheep deck on top of the cattle deck, so it was very dark inside. But then you get to the points where you've got vessels like the Ocean Swagman pictured there, which just became an absolute delight to sail on.
Thanks, the two Johns. Look, you always learn, don't you? Life is a constant process of learning. John just referred to some of the learnings in vessel designs, but it would be remiss of me not to refer to the crises that have confronted the industry over the years. I mean, the industry has hit the headlines on several occasions. I mean, you know, the most recent incidents that of real significance, I think, while I've been involved in the industry, have been the Cormo, and then the Four Corners program, and then the Yawasi. But you know, there are others before and during that time, other incidents. Look, I've got a friend of mine, in fact, an ex managing director of Meat and Livestock Australia, has this saying: "You never waste a good crisis." And I wonder, Steve, if you could talk about some of the improvements that have been prompted by those incidents.
Yes, thanks, Peter. And 30 years at Wellard, I had my share of them, I can tell you. Unfortunately, learning from a crisis cuts both ways, but industry's constant take-up of new systems and processes were accelerated after each crisis event. So we're on a 50-year journey of continuous improvement, but we got to kick up the arse every time there was a crisis. The Farad Ferez, which caught fire and sank, and other vessel-related incidents resulted in stricter and more diligent vessel approval and monitoring. As a consequence, Australians' AMSA standards are the global benchmark for those countries that make any effort to regulate livestock vessels from trading from their ports, and there are plenty of countries that don't have any standards. The maiden voyage of the Bee Crooks in 2002, on which Boss Taurus cattle suffered heat stress and many were lost, resulted in the development of hot stuff heat stress management software. That was a global first and is still used to assess and manage risk in shipments over summer periods. when the Awassi Express footage was released, prompting another review, allometric stocking densities were implemented and the standards adjusted accordingly. There can be no doubt that the application of these new management tools has had a major positive impact on animal welfare and commercial outcomes for the industry, to the point that after 50 years of continuous improvement and many millions of dollars of R&D, the trade can rightfully and unquestionably boast as leading the global animal production industry in welfare outcomes, bar none. The flip side of a crisis, when it does occur, is that it provides the anti-trade lobby with material to target politicians and the public, who in the main are genuinely naive and easily influenced by what are usually very graphic and disturbing images. It's pretty obvious that the 2011 cattle trade halt was a direct result of politicians bending to these influences, as is the case now with the ban on the sheep trade coming into effect in 2028. The tragedy in this is that 50 years of experience, learnings and continuous improvement have been ignored to win a few votes in inner city seats in the eastern states. The reversal of the ban when a coalition government is eventually returned will be too late. The supporting infrastructure is already falling away. Feedlots on the outskirts of Perth on land worth many millions of dollars won't remain. Ships will not renew Australian certification, and new ships just aren't being built. Unlike government policy, planning and development of this necessary supporting infrastructure is years in the making.
Thanks, Steve. Of course, you know, unfortunately, in a sense, those crises grab the headlines and get embedded into the perceptions of the public and the community. But John Cunnington, can you just talk generally about, you know, Steve referred to it, the animal welfare improvements that have occurred over the years. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and last time I say this next sentence, I had the RSPCA WA CEO write a op-ed piece in the West Australian about me, but the industry is recording the best results in the history for its voyages. There's data now that shows the daily mortality rate across the production and transport systems is lowest when sheep and cattle are in the live export supply chain. So, I mean, at the end of the day, that really sums it up. But Steve previously talked about the outcomes as a result of a crisis, and I'd just like to reiterate that the industry just didn't change when crises were happening. There was incremental changes over the 50 years, and they continually will be by exporters and our partners in the supply chain. Like any businesses involving animals, the journey has been one about the incremental improvements, and we transport the most perishable of products. We're moving live animals over long distances and over vast oceans. But at the end of the day, most of us in Southeast Asia are paid on discharge weight, and so it's imperative that they're getting there, number one, alive, but in the best condition possible, because a dead animal pays nobody. So, I mean, in the 1990s, sheep mortalities were around 2%. Then by 2003, they were at 1%, 2017, 0.7%, and now they're saying 0.2%. Cattle industry has been seeing record high success rates for the last 20 plus years. But I think now when we look at things like SCAS, and what makes me really proud, I've got my team in Indonesia and they send through photos, and here they are in back jungles of Indonesia when we're doing specific jobs. And these are areas that sometimes have never seen Australian cattle before, yet our team is out there teaching them about low stress stock handling, teaching them about slaughtering methods, and teaching them about animal welfare. And this isn't just a training program that guys sit in and move on with their day. They're making generational shifts in attitudes towards animal welfare. And I cannot emphasize that enough. And I mean, we haven't really been able to tell that story about the actual change in market that is happening, but it's something to be really proud of. And just finally, touching on organisations like LiveCorp, where industries invested millions of dollars over the years, along with exporters and the importers. The importers are instrumental in all these changes that have been making. So, yeah, it's been huge over the years.
I mean, it's interesting that that was one of the points that Andrew Robb raised, wasn't it? The enormous goodwill shown to Australia, not only for supplying the product, but also for the animal welfare and the care that we take of animals overseas. Listen, I note that we've only got 50 seconds left on the clock in front of me. But look, is there any fast final comments that you wish to make, gentlemen?
So I'm sure we'll run a little bit over time, but they're important messages. What we've learnt, and certainly what I've learnt, is that no matter how good you become, how world-class your outcomes are, it means nothing if you're on the wrong side of the debate in electorates that are critical to form government. Why else would you destroy a world-class trade that supplies critical and culturally important products to long-standing trade partners who have taken on, at great cost, the imposition of SGAS and invested millions to comply with our standards? In the future, Australia's shame won't be live sheep exports. It will be how we turned our back on our customers and the export of our animal welfare standards to markets that were embracing this change.
And similarly for myself, over my 45-year journey in the industry, and for us as exporters and producers, we have been told for years that we must supply what the customer wants, and that's what we have collectively been doing for over 6 decades to the benefits of the country through live sheep and cattle exports. Opposition to the trade continues to loom large again with a new target in sight. Industry should pay heed to the fact that its professionalism and welfare performance can be lost in the noise of politics and activism, so it must be ready and not go quietly in the next fight.
As Steve and John touched on, we should never take for granted that the industry will have the support of government and that the industry is safe. But from this perspective, the live cattle growth plan is being developed by LiveCorp and ALEC to cement industry's position as part of the cattle industry and ensure prosperity for the industry over the next decade. But this will take the whole of the supply chain buying in and supporting it to ensure its success. So my party message is for everyone to get involved and not assume somebody else has got it covered. Be involved, be vocal, and be proud of the industry that we've all created.
Thanks, John. I think that's an incredibly important final message. Look, time's up. Look, my final task is just to thank the panellists for their contribution. You know, an enormous store of knowledge to my left, many, many years in the trade, and I hope that we've all benefited from the discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Johns and Steve. Look, we are a little bit over time, which means you'll have a shorter cup of tea, but if there are any burning questions, we'll take a couple while the people are here with it. So, such a wealth of knowledge. Are there any questions? Right, there is one. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I can't see you too well on the light, but there's... You just say who you are, it'd be nice so people know who we're talking to.
Certainly. Digby Stretch, PGA. Can I just make a comment? As a sheep producer, I wonder how long it would have taken us to get a scabby mouth vaccine if you guys hadn't been having to have it happen. Because I know, with or without live export, that is a really important vaccine or a procedure that's happened in our sheep flock. So good on you for getting it there. It's a bit like Formula One cars. We don't really need them to take the kids to school, but the technology that came out of it will be in family cars in 10 years' time. So it's more an observation than a question, but well done, guys.
So Digby, I'll answer that because I was chair of the Scabby Mouth Coordinating Committee. I've got that on my business card, actually. it wouldn't have happened. There was no imperative. The sole reason that that vaccine was developed was to get the reopening of the Saudi trade. And there was quite a lot of resource put into it. Vaccine companies wouldn't have stacked it up if there wasn't a program down the track that was going to require millions of sheep to be vaccinated to go to that particular market.
Thank you, Steve. Anything further? All right. Well, I can at this stage thank you, and it just reminded me of that talk. Sorry. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Yep. It's hard to see on these lights. Sorry. So yell out if I miss you.
Thank you. My name's Annaline. I am not a producer, farmer, or anything to do with living on the land apart from being alive. I'm a human nutritionist. I'll be speaking tomorrow. And so I found this session, the entire thing, completely fascinating. And I think you had a picture of a newspaper article about activists being really excited that they are going to pretty much end what passed the last newspaper article that was up there. And so from my perspective as a human nutritionist who studies human behavior, it is clear as day, whether you agree with them or not, they have a strategy behind what they do. They have a strategy behind what they communicate. And so my question is, listening as a complete outsider, I just think you guys are awesome. Like, this is phenomenal what you do. I still don't understand why you want to do it because it's so complicated and difficult, but, you know, kudos to you for doing it. What is your strategy behind storytelling? Like, if you just put this stuff out there, as an urban person, why does it have to resonate with us? So what's the strategy behind it? Yeah.
Thank you. Who wants to have a crack at that?
The why question is probably, I don't know. But around the storytelling, I can sit here with the likes of Holly and Stephen Bolt and the team at Livestock Collective, and we've really been looking into the idea of storytelling over the past 5-6 years. And it's about, if you went to the average punter in the street and asked them their top 50 concerns, live export wouldn't be in the top 50. The other side of it is, if you don't like palm oil, you go buy palm oil-free products. The consumer, though, doesn't have the purchasing power for live export. And it really makes it an interesting topic because there is no, when asked in the survey, there's no actual, it's emotionally easy to say, yeah, get rid of it, because they don't understand the connection to it. So the storytelling is similar to why we have ads for BHP on the TV. But we're not buying the iron ore directly, but we need to storytell to show why the industry has effects right through the supply chain. And what we're seeing with the phase out of the sheep is the local IGA closing down, the local tyre guy shutting down. As people move into increasing grain, country towns are reducing, and footy clubs are going to need to be consolidated across towns. So the storytelling is more about the impacts that the industry has on wider regional community, and showing that we are humans behind this. It's not some boogeyman behind the dark type thing, and the impacts that the trade has not only on Australia, but helping them understand that food security is a real thing. And Australia hasn't really understood that until COVID came along, and it was the first time you went to the shops and you saw bare shelves and you really actually started to worry. Well, other countries that don't have the ability to produce as much food as us, that is a fear for their governments, because a hungry society is a rioting society that will overturn a government. And I think that's where the story of food security also becomes important.
Thank you, John. Does that answer your question? Thank you. All right. Okay, are there any others I missed? All right. Well, we'll wind it up there. And I was just going to say that the discussion here did remind me, I'm in my first interaction with the live export industry, apart from being a producer, was in 1978. I was part of a group of farmers who took over the wharf in Albany and loaded a ship that was being picketed by the Metro meat workers at the time. So it was quite a volatile situation. Police involved. We were carted in cattle trucks covered in tarps so we wouldn't get molested, and dropped at the ship, and we manned the ship and they loaded all the sheep and away it went. So interesting times.
Just to say how complicated the trade is, Metro Meat was also an exporter of sheep.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. I think it was a Metro ship. But the abattoir was right at the wharf, so it was very easy for the meat workers to walk out and just blockade the wharf. So anyway, things have moved on. We're now going to break for morning tea.